is because I've realized over my past several years working as chief medical officer in different organizations, how important it is to understand the regulatory pathway. This is something that for the chief medical officers is really relevant. We really need to not just be involved in the interactions with the agency. We also need to ensure that we understand all the elements that are relevant to that. And in my case, in this company I'm right now working with ASC Therapeutics, I also have the opportunity to not only work on the regulatory pathway for in the US, also in China. And this is a topic that we're going to be discussing here because we three have this kind of experience with it. It's unusual. And I must say, we don't need, by the way, to put together any paperwork as foreign agents as others, so we are fine the way we are working and understanding this pathway. Just think about China as the second place in the world in terms of clinical trials around all type of therapeutic areas. So we think that that's something that the audience should be interested in understanding, and definitely we're also going to talk about Europe, Japan, and other opportunities. So let me start with our first topic here, which is how we as chief medical officers of Biotechs are able to talk and interact in this environment with very complex regulatory requirements from different agencies, especially from a global perspective. How do we do that? So let's start with you, Shefali.
Sure. So I think it's a challenge because the requirements are different in Europe versus China versus US. What I've seen with my experience is that US, at least they have opportunities of expedited approval. They're much more lenient in terms of unmet need and trying to get the products out there for patients. They are actually more willing to work with you in terms of even if you have a smaller package, phase 2 study. It's very different in Europe, where they really look for randomized studies, placebo-controlled studies, because it's kind of interlinked with the pricing and reimbursement. And then China is a completely different thing, and Japan as well, where, when you talk about NDA, you talk about PK studies, you want ethnicity, data matching, and things like that. So I think overall, it's the biggest challenge for a CMO or a chief development officer is to see how do you do these trials that are globally relevant, and how could you actually have a strategy upfront designing trials that may be relevant across globally.
Ramon.
Yes, so my own European filing experience is from previous companies. It's something that we now start here. We have initiated the interactions with the EMA. But collectively, indeed, there are differences in my experience as well. With the US, typically, and it's very hands-on, very involved. That's something that, especially a small biotech, is extremely welcome, because to have input in your programs, in your designs very early on, that is very important. But again, I get back to the point of trust, because I think if you build that relationship of trust, it will be a very different, perhaps more meaningful and proactive interaction. China is different. Of course, a lot that happens in China is in the Chinese language. So you're somewhat handicapped if you don't speak Chinese. With meetings, with formal meetings, most of that is in Chinese, at least in our case. So you do rely on people around you who speak Chinese and who then themselves personally have that relationship with the Chinese authority. So as a CMO based here, there is a layer in between that you have to of course, heavily rely on. I think decision-making in China perhaps might be a little different too. Expectations and guidance is much clearer with the US FDA, in my experience, than with Chinese health authorities. Of course, at the end, we all and everywhere, all health authorities will adhere to ICH guidelines, but then there are stylistic differences. That is currently an important focus for us, these two areas. Perhaps regarding Japan, maybe the two of you can talk towards that.
Thank you, Ramon. So let me give you my experience, which is related to my career. I started with, let's say, corporate big pharma with AbbVie, almost 15 years, and regulatory and several other functions were practically led by experts in that field. When I started going down in the path to smaller and smaller companies, I started realizing how important it was for me to understand regulatory. And you can imagine the difference between doing regulatory for the US or Europe and then moving into the Chinese environment. And the first thing that I had to do is exactly what you just said. I needed someone that was able to speak Chinese. And I was very lucky. About 6 months ago, I brought, reporting to me, a vice president that not only speaks Chinese, but he had been the majority of his career in the United States representing Chinese companies, Fosun and Hengrui, very well known. He was VP for these two companies, and he is now my right hand. So I don't really need to do else more than having the right person working with me. So it's very important for all of us to ensure that we have the right team supporting our needs and our expectations. Let me move to another topic, and this is general. It's not just about China, but in general, biotechs in some way have to think about bringing in someone, as I just mentioned, in our organization, or working with regulatory consultants. And I would like to hear your opinion about what do you think is more relevant, probably also depending on the global regulators that we are talking about. Let's start with you again this time.
Yes. So it is my personal belief that core functions always have to reside within the company. Regulatory is so essential. For me, it's hard to imagine to outsource this. I can see that may happen very early on with companies, but I think very soon this is such a key position in my mind should reside within the organization. We take a very pragmatic approach with our regulatory interactions and processes. We have a full-time regulatory officer in-house who's very experienced. But at the end, also if you interact with the FDA verbally, but also in writing, there are always different interpretations possible, and regulatory is its own language. Sometimes, I don't know about the two of you and everyone here, but sometimes I as a CMO don't pick up the fine nuances in the way the FDA at times phrases something, but then you will find that the regulatory experts, they do that, and they provide you the right guidance. The pragmatic way that we take is not only do we have a full-time regulatory officer in-house, we have 3 external consultants as well who are highly experienced, and some of them have been ex-FDA, and that way we discuss, we turn each sentence, each word probably of all those communications to make sure that we get the point that is being made, which not always is made that clearly. So that's the approach we take. We put a lot of emphasis in our company on the regulatory approach and resources.
Thanks, Ramon. So, Shefali.
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the company and what stage the company is. In our case, we are a clinical and commercial stage company, so there are a lot of regulations, both in terms of commercial, promotion and things like that, and then also development. In my case, we are a smaller biotech, so we have a small group for oversight, and regulatory strategy, but a lot of regulatory operations part, that is submission of packages and things like that, we outsource with vendors like MedPace and others. They actually work and submit, although we may write the documents, whether it's briefing book and things like that. I think I agree with you that we do need internal expertise for regulatory interactions with the agencies, because we are the sponsor. We want to make sure that we are able to communicate what we are thinking about in terms of strategy. I think the other part is, like I mentioned, with Epizyme, we are developing in China. We just got approval in Japan. We are also filing in Europe. And all those things we can do ourselves. And it's a lot of work. So we basically have experts, organizations who are experts in like European, like Vizon and others, or people who actually are, like you said, ex-FDA consultants who can review some documents because they have experience. So it depends on, if you're big companies like Pfizer and BMS, you have everything in-house. But a smaller biotech like ours, we have a mixed model.
Yeah, I agree. We need a kind of mixed model, but it depends, as you just said, on the type of focus that we have in terms of the regulatory agency. In our case, for instance, AAC Therapeutics, we feel perfectly comfortable with our approach to the U.S. agency, to the FDA. We don't need any external consultants. On the other hand, we are right now applying for an orphan drug designation in Europe, and we are taking a consultant for that. And definitely the moment that we start thinking about China, and in our case, we're building their clinical, regulatory, and manufacturing capacity there, we definitely need, especially in the earlier stages, to rely on companies there. So we practically went through a number of organizations that were, and we selected the one that is now helping us, starting from the beginning. We have a pre-IND, then IND submission, and what differentiates the way we are doing that versus other organizations, I would say that's something I would like to recommend to others, is when you go into these countries, maybe Japan, China, or Latin America, is very, very useful that you have already a very clear endorsement from the FDA. The moment that you have that, you can practically move into the others, because obviously there is a clear recognition, even by the Chinese agency, that if you have already an IND clearance, as we have, for instance, for our gene therapy for hemophilia A, already from the FDA, is much easier to go through the different steps of pre-IND, IND filing, and so on. Let's now move into another topic that we discussed also. Again, I'm just following up the preparation that we did with Liz O'Brien, and we were talking also about submissions and filings for orphan drug designation, for instance. What can you tell me, Shefali, your experience there in different regulatory environments?
Yeah, I think, our company, Epizyme, has got approval in orphan designation. It's epithelioid sarcoma, which is about 300, 400 patients. It's a very small population. And we actually got an ODAC for that particular indication, which we were very successful. It's a very different field because there are multiple things, not only how do you do trials in this environment, and how do you fulfill requirements by the agency when you're especially doing a confirmatory trial, which is like almost the size of the population. And so in terms of all orphan designation, I think it's very helpful. We were able to get a lot of discussion with the agency because of fast track and orphan designation with the FDA. And I think that really helped us in ODAC as well in terms of understanding the unmet need and how small the population is. It's a little different in Europe, as you rightly said. There's completely different requirements for orphan designation. It's not based on patient numbers. There are many things that you have to qualify, including unmet need and how do you differentiate with the current therapies, standard of care. And then in China, it's totally different as well. So I think it's variable depending on the region. I feel with my experience more open in US to get an orphan designation than especially in China, although they follow US FDA quite a bit.
Thank you, Shefali. Ramon, I know that we discussed, you don't have experience actually on orphan drug designation. Any other type of regulatory designations that you think are also relevant to discuss here?
Yes, so the approach that we like to take is to seek a breakthrough designation. I think that always is very helpful. Of course, it comes with certain requirements. One has to fulfill certain requirements. Of course, that differs from company to company, but we're at BeyondSpring, we like to go into areas of unmet medical need. That's what we focus on, and that also comes with an innovative approach to that, to addressing that area of unmet medical need. We try to seek that designation, and we received that for CIN for the first NDA application, and we will now also seek that for the non-small cell lung cancer application.
Thanks, Ramon. So let me tell you my experience with orphan drug designation in China. And this is that there is no orphan drug designation in China, by the way. So what we have there is that in 2018, the NMPA, which is, again, the China FDA, prepares a list of diseases that they consider rare diseases. And this list is reviewed every 3 years. So we expect that sometime around this year it could be updated. We have one disease, which is hemophilia A, which is considered already one of these rare diseases, but the other one is not. And we're going to push for it. So we're going to try to let the agency in China know that we think that graft versus host disease in patients that receive bone marrow transplantation should be considered that, and let's see if we're lucky. So this is one example of the kind of things that you need to do in the different organizations. And another anecdote, because it happened to me just a few days ago, is that we realized that in China, for instance, besides working with the federal agency, let's call it that way, there are certain CDAEs, which are the clinical development centers, and or centers of drug evaluation, excuse me. And there is one that is about to be formed in Shanghai. And my CEO is right now in Shanghai, so we're trying to get a meeting with them. So, all these designations, all these type of approaches require understanding also a little bit and navigating the different environments and the different characteristics of these countries. Today we have been focusing on China, but I think that we have about a little bit over 2 minutes. If there are any questions from the audience in any aspect related to regulatory, we just touched on some of them, but we would be very happy to discuss them. And also related to, again, how the chief medical officers relate to regulatory, and how do we help on that environment. I know regulatory is not one of these areas that the people really are so excited about, but
so I got a question.
It's coming. Very good.
Yeah, and the question relates to, the other half of the regulatory strategy is the reimbursement strategy. All right, so regulatory almost is dwarfed by the complexities of what happens with the reimbursement, especially ex-US, in areas like China and Europe and all over the place. How do you couple the long-term regulatory strategy with the reimbursement strategy, and what is the role of the CMO in that process?
Excellent question. So
Yeah, I mean, I've had a recent experience in this, and it's a very tough one because, you especially in Europe, as you said, that you have to submit into EMA, and you have a different regulatory strategy based on unmet need. But then you have to deal with countries like UK. You have to deal with Germany, France, that have totally different reimbursement policies. And there you have to work with the commercial team very closely, market research to figure out what's the best way. So even if you have Europe approval, EMA approval, let's say, where you have so many different steps like PIP and other things that you have to make sure you have checkbox before you submit. And then again, like I said, the bar is much higher in Europe than US in terms of requirement for the study trial designs and things like that, mainly randomized studies. The challenge that comes is that how do you decouple an EMA strategy, which is EU5 and things like that, and then reimbursement. I think what we have done successfully so far, at least, is that we first think about regulatory strategy for approval, and then according to whether you would want to have a commercial partner, ex-US, or you actually think about going yourself, you kind of go into different countries depending on the complexity of reimbursement in those countries.
So thank you, Shefali. Thank you, Ramon. I think it was a very interesting conversation for everyone. And again, thank you to organizers and, of course, to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.